community during a Zoom bombing incident last week at a Black History Month event on Monday, February the 15th. So tonight is a first step for our campus and first of I think a number of steps that we'll be taking over the coming semester, and I would say over the coming years, to really explore many aspects of what this represents. Not only things we can do to prevent this from the technical point of view, things we can do to explore the conditions that we're living in that have led to this kind of an event, and also things we can do at the level of our educational curriculum, working with communities. So all aspects of this. And so I would just consider this as a first step. The first thing I would say then is that the Black Studies Center director, Dr. Fred Dixon, approached me over the weekend about co-hosting this event, and I readily agreed. I'm really eager to take this on, not only from my office as the president of the university, but also just as a community member and as an activity that I wanted to wholeheartedly support throughout the coming semester and beyond. I think it's really the first step towards a community dialogue that we'll have on these matters. So I'm committed to having these conversations with not only members of the campus community, but members of the surrounding communities and across the state of Wyoming, and at a national level as well. I think we can have a dialogue with thought leaders from across the country and also from across the state, and certainly from within our campus as well. So tonight's event has three panelists, individuals from the Black Studies Center, which I will now introduce. So first of all, we have Dr. Fred Douglas Dixon, that is Frederick Douglass Dixon, the director of the University of Wyoming Black Studies Center. A lifelong resident of Chicago, Frederick Douglass Dixon is an educator, historian, and community advocate. In addition to his role with our Black Studies Center, he works as an assistant professor in the African American and Diaspora Department. The theoretical perspective that self-improvement is the basis of community development guides his actions as a scholar activist. As his indispensable duty, he remains devoted to providing successful pathways for the most at-risk students towards access, matriculation, and the ultimate goal of graduation. He believes the responsibilities of the professoriate include connecting the classroom with the larger community. To that end, Professor Dixon's theories regarding connecting formal education with the broader community permitted him to work with multiple national educational organizations. His community engagement with grassroots organizations produced focus groups, male initiatives, DUI, and reentry pilot programs. A quote from him shows his depth and his purpose. Quote, "The thrust of my experience is to elevate the whole of the Black community to higher levels of academic excellence." So welcome, Fred. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jacqueline Bridgeman. Dr. Jacqueline Bridgeman has been a member of the University of Wyoming College of Law, and as both faculty member and as an adjunct faculty member in the African American and Diaspora Studies since 2002. She became Associate Dean of Academic Affairs for the College of Law in 2010 and Associate Dean for the Program Development and Kepler Professor in the College of Law in August of 2013. She was appointed Interim Dean of the College of Law in 2013 and served in that capacity through 2015. In 2017, she was appointed the interim and inaugural director of the School of Culture, Gender, and Social Justice in the University of Wyoming College of Arts and Sciences, and she became the permanent director in 2019. She also serves as a magistrate judge for the Albany County, Wyoming Integrated Juvenile Treatment Program. Dr. Bridgeman received her Bachelor of Arts with honors from Stanford University and her JD from the University of Chicago. And then thirdly, we have Ms. Timberly Vogel, who serves as the Director of Community Engagement in the University of Wyoming's Black Studies Center and is also an alumna of our university, having received her degree in sociology in the fall of 2020. Following graduation, Timberly co-founded a grassroots movement called the Laramie Human Rights Network in order to advocate for criminal justice reform. So the format for this evening's meeting is that we'll have opening comments from initially Dr. Bridgeman and Dr. Dixon, And then we have moderators who will take questions and then provide them to us to respond. We have until 8 o'clock this evening, so we have in principle 2 hours. And if we need that time, we'll take it. And if we don't need it, then we'll conclude, and hopefully we'll have a number of things that we think about and we take as actions for follow-up meetings and a continuing dialogue here in the campus. So I'd like to just turn it over. Welcome to the three of you, and I really appreciate being able to partner with you tonight. So who would like to go first then, if it's Dr. Dixon or Dr. Bridgeman?
Dr. Dixon, I think you're up.
Okay, so thank you, President Seidel. And we wanted to make sure that as we're doing these introductions, that Timberly Vogel has a way to introduce herself as well. And I'm thinking why we're here. And I think about the University of Wyoming and how we want to move forward as an institution that deals directly with race, racism, and bigotry and racists. By now, many people know that we had an incident February 15th while in the midst of a webinar that was discussing one of the layered nuances of the death of Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre of 1921. If you've known about this particular incident, there was racial epithets, there was pornography, and the most disrespectful show of outward manifestation of hate that I have ever partaked or ever been a witness to over 20 years, particularly in higher ed. And to have this conversation tonight, I thank President Seidel for allowing for this platform. But my hope is tonight that we can come up with some ways to have concrete conversation about the core of the issue. And I believe the core of the issue of what transpired the other night is fear and hate. And if we can go into those in a way that allows for a conversation, then I agree with you, President Seidel. This is the first step. But I do believe it's mandatory to talk about the systemic problematic issues that face the University of Wyoming, particularly when it comes to race and how we respond to it. So we do thank you for providing this platform. And for me and for others, this will definitely be one way that we can critique or judge which way we look to moving forward in the future. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Fred. So Jackie, would you like to also make a statement?
Yeah, and I think I'll just sort of follow up and maybe provide a little more detail with what my colleague Dr. Dixon said. You know, when something like this happens and it's as horrific as it was, right, it serves as a call to arms, and at least for a little while, everyone wants to do something about it, right? And they reach out and all of that. But even just in this last week, I've seen instances where people have minimized this incident, where there's been discussion about why are we even having this town hall? Why do we keep talking about it? This wasn't even perpetrated by someone at this university, so why are we making such a big deal about it? Why on some level do we even have a Black Study Center? Or are we having all these events? These things don't happen in a place like Wyoming. And so I think in my opening remarks, I'd like to speak to that question of why, right? And while this one event was certainly horrific in public, I think part of the reason why we're having this conversation is this is not the only event of this type that happens at this university. This just happened to be a very public one where other people got the chance to witness it and have a sense of what that's like. You know, we can talk more about that, but I think if one of our goals as a university, as an institution, as a state, and even as a nation is to create a place where people can go to work and not have to worry about being assaulted, where everyone has the same chance to thrive and be part of the community and a productive member of that community, then we have to address these issues. And we have to be able to engage in some really hard conversations. You know, one of the things that happens when we bring up issues of dealing with race is there's always this question about, well, if we do something for the Black community, for example, we're giving them special treatment, or we're carving out something that isn't fair. And one of the things that I think this incident highlights is the degree to which that underlying assumption that we're all sitting in the same equal place to begin with just isn't true, right? That incident was directed at a particular part of our population. And the folks that were targeted had to maintain their professionalism in the face of that horrific act. They had to get up the next day and do their jobs like everyone else has to do their jobs. And now in the wake of that, is wonderful as I think the opportunity for this conversation is, you know, and I'm sort of looking at my colleague, Dr. Dixon, I don't know how many hours we've spent in the last week fielding calls about this, answering questions about how we move forward. And so not only do you have a heavier burden because of your race in doing this work, you also then have to do extra work to provide solutions for things that to a large extent really aren't your fault. And so the question as to why do we do this is the hope that although these things, this particular incident may have happened outside of the university, we are part of a larger system of inequality that we all have a responsibility to address. And doing nothing is in a lot of ways being complicit. At the same time, one of the things I think we found in the wake of this incident is that the University of Wyoming does not have good support mechanisms for underrepresented people, for people of color in general, and especially when these things happen. So I think hopefully this will spark conversation to where we can start improving on a lot of those things we need to improve upon.
Thanks very much. And so I'd like to just make a quick comment on your two comments, and then we'll turn to Ms. Vogel as well. So I first of all, I want to just say, if there are any of you out there who did not witness the event, or if it was initially live and then the next morning it was still available for a short while to view it, and I wasn't there in the evening, but I saw it the next morning, and it was one of the most disgusting events of racism that I've ever seen in my entire life, and I completely admire those of you who endured that and then continue to act in a professional manner. I don't know if I could have done it. It was, and I felt absolutely shaken. And I just want to say that the fact that we're having this this event tonight, although catalyzed by that, it's not merely about that. It's about the social condition that we're living in that led to events like that. And we weren't the only one. There were others around the country that had similar kinds of attacks. And so to me, it just reveals the depth of the problems that we have to address here. So I'm committed to making this not just an event tonight or an event next week or the week after that, but something that we really talk about here on the campus. And I think that's what a university campus is in one sense for, to have these kinds of ideas explored, and then we can do things within our communities in order to address them. So anyway, I'd like to then just turn to Timberly Vogel. Go ahead.
Thank you, President Seidel, for inviting me tonight and allowing me to speak on this panel. I don't want to repeat exactly what my colleagues have said before me, but I do think it is something that everyone has hit on, is that this event from the 15th does not exist in a vacuum. And I think that's extremely evident from just having conversations with our underrepresented and marginalized groups, not only on campus, but within the community. And so I am looking forward to this town hall and the future work we are doing together, because during my time as an undergrad, we had, and president of the Black Student Alliance, we had numerous town halls with the revolving amount of presidents and dean of students to talk about these issues and to talk about what we could do on campus. And it always seemed to be less about what the students had to say or what the faculty and staff had to say, but what the administration was unable to do or unable to think of. And so in result of that, it always came back onto these underrepresented and underfunded programs and students to sort of fix their own mess. And so I think what this town hall and your invitation to this, how it's taking a step away from those previous events is realizing that even though this particular interruption from the 15th may or may not have come from students within our community, it is still a community issue. It's a university issue, and it has to be addressed and fixed by the entire community rather than just those most impacted by it. And so I'm really looking forward to exploring ideas you're bringing to the table and policy changes and reanalyzing the priorities of the entire university to see where these most marginalized populations fall and what the university is willing to do to help fix it and prevent not only against incidents like this, but the ideologies that foster people to make actions like this. So thank you for inviting me again tonight, and I'm looking forward to it.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. And so what I'd like to do now is, first of all, see if there are any other kind of opening remarks that any of the three of you would like to make as we kind of get started. But I really want to make this a dialogue with our community. And I thought maybe we could separate it into two things. I don't know if we haven't really rehearsed this, but this is just my thinking. The first thing would be just to get some people to talk about how they're feeling about this, because I personally find it still very upsetting. And those of you who have not only witnessed it in person, but see events like this throughout your lives, I can imagine how much more deeply you feel about it. So I'd like to maybe talk about how people are feeling, and then kind of switch towards maybe more suggestions on how we should go forward in terms of collecting ideas, things we could do. And we also, I'm sure you all know, we have a group as we're doing all of our strategic planning for the university around first of all, strategic planning and program reviews. We have these 4 pillars around more inclusive, more interdisciplinary, more entrepreneurial, and more digital. So we do have a pillar on how to build an inclusive and diverse community here. And so there's already a working group going on there under my office and under the provost's office, that is. And then there are other activities, of course, all across the campus. So there are ways to take ideas and turn them into not just into working groups, but into programmatic changes that we might think about undertaking. So I really would like to get into a discussion about what practically are the kinds of things we can do. So anyway, are there any other comments that any of the three of you would like to make just to, before we get open up for questions? And by the way, when we go into questions, we have it moderated. So we have my chief of staff, Mary Ivanoff, and also Lisa Stafford will be taking questions. And I would like it if you submitted a question, if you do it anonymously, that's fine. Then it'll be asked on your behalf. But if you submit your name, then we will identify you as well. So anyway, so who would like to make additional comments before we kind of open up for questions and dialogue?
I'll take the opportunity. I look at this under the paradigm of something that we can dissect here right now. The paradigm of racism without racists, which in itself is a way to get to the core of the matter. Well, when we think about racism, we know that it exists. We know that it exists in the state of Wyoming. We know that it exists at the University of Wyoming. We know that it exists in Laramie and all across the country. But think about the term racism without racists. It seems as if it allows for justifications for those actions, attitudes, and behaviors that are forced upon many by those who are actually racist. But there's not one person on this call who will raise their hand to admit that they're racist, but we all agree that racism exists. So with the justifications, and let's talk about some of the things that become justifications. Dr. Jackie touched on it early, Timberly mentioned it early, even some of the things that you have said, President Seidel, when we think about those who carry the burden. It's very oxymoronic tonight that we have this panel here those who are most at risk of these racist practices are now setting the pace to explain to the racists what the problem is, how that becomes problematic, and have to point out the justifications for it. So there's a term that people use quite often. They call it racial battle fatigue. And that's what we're dealing with. This idea of having to stand up and explain to those who are the most in power about the problem, about the daily rhythms of the university, which I find to be very interesting. Interesting in the fact that we know systematic racism exists. We know institutional racism exists, but there are no racists. So when we begin to look at this problem that we saw in this particular light, then it should be able to cut through some of the justifications and look at things as a way of exposing. Let's look at some of the justifications and make sure that they are broken down to a position where those who have systematically and historically had ways of not dealing with it, well, one way that people deal with it is just not acknowledging it. Mm-hmm. And what we find daily, not just here, but all across the country, is these rising waves of racism, even to the point where we saw groups, thousands of people storm a Capitol because something that they thought, January 6th, something they thought they did not get that they deserved. So if we think about it, when we use the term racism without racists, then we can cut that right there. And we'll get to those racists and those particularly who have traditionally gotten around that particular paradigm, particularly now when we think about this incident. I've had calls, as Dr. Jackie said, from all across the country. Well, how are you doing? Well, how's everything going? In solidarity. Let me explain to you. We understand wholeheartedly that there is a group of people who really believe that that was a horrific act. We also know that there are groups who believe that because of the conversation, and as influential as the conversation or as salient as the conversation, that we deserved it just because we had that conversation. And then there are some people who flat out said that we had gone too far. So when John Lewis said things about setting the pace for getting in good trouble, he didn't create the parameters and the outcomes for good trouble. Good trouble was set for him by those who controlled him. So thinking about it through the lens of racism without racists will allow for us to look at the problem in the core. And that's, I think, very important tonight.
Okay. And I think it's very deep. And in fact, depending on how this evening goes, I want to kind of turn to the audience for some dialogue and see where they want to take it. But you could imagine having an entire session devoted to this topic as you were describing it. And I like the idea. I'll call you Dr. Fred and Dr. Jackie and Timberly. Okay. So, all right. So
Dr. Timberly.
Dr. Timberly, good. So you can call me President Ed. So that, anyway, let's move on. So I would like to then turn to some dialogue with the community that are out there. So either Mary or Lisa, do you have a question that you'd like to read or a comment?
President Seidel, Janae Jennings says, I am a graduate student right now, but I did get my undergraduate degree here at the University of Wyoming. I've never felt completely safe here, but with everything going on now, I do not feel safe at all. My question is, what steps will be taken to make sure myself and other people of color feel safe in the Laramie community?
That's obviously a very deep question, and I would like some commentary from any of you who have suggestions about this. So I would just say, first of all, my heart goes out to you for feeling that way on our campus, and so we want to make sure that we take whatever steps we can to address that. And I'm sure you're not alone in that. I'm sure there are many people who share that feeling. So I would like to just sort of turn it to the panel to see if you have suggestions, and also to the audience if you have suggestions on things we could do. Maybe we'll have a little mini session on this topic. What do we need to do to make our community feel safe on this campus?
I think I'll jump in first. And piggybacking on one of the things Dr. Dixon said, I think because that sentiment has been true and expressed by a lot of people for a long time. on this campus in different ways. And I think one of the reasons why we have not really even begun to sufficiently address that is at the heart of what Dr. Dixon was saying, is that we do not seem to have accepted that there are racism problems on this campus and in our community. We tend to think that all of these things are kind of a one-off or an isolated incident, or it's only bad people who do it, and it's not part of the whole way we think about things and go about doing business. So I think until we affirmatively commit to making this a safe and welcoming place for all people, rather than excusing away why we're not like that racist person or we don't have that problem that they have in other places, I don't even think we're having the right conversation yet to begin to address these issues. You know, and every time it comes up, there's always explaining for why it's not an issue or why it's okay, rather than focusing on starting from the assumption or the baseline that we know it's a problem. We know there are people who don't feel safe, all kinds of people on this campus who don't feel safe. What can we do to do everything we can to make sure that's no longer the case, both on our campus and in the greater Laramie community? Right?
Other comments? Thanks.
Yes, I can understand, and that was a A+ question, because this needs to go from theory to practice. But I understand that there's, for me, as a Black man in America, there's not a safe space over the 196,940,000 square miles on this planet Earth where I feel comfortable. I feel more comfortable leaving a laptop in the computer and that it will be there than I do with my encounters with the police. And the police represent authority. But there's groups of people, as we've seen, who have for years been trained that when there is a mob mentality, that it usurps the police, which means they're in concert, because this becomes a power dynamic. So I'm not even sure that the University of Wyoming is capable of protecting me. Not that they're not interested, or not that they are, but I know for sure that they're incapable of protecting me if I happen to travel into the community at the wrong time, under the wrong circumstances. And you would figure at this point, as much as we've been making sure that we add to the mainstream narrative in the public, it's got to be some folks that we see every day who don't agree with it, who would, under the right circumstances, be willing to move forward in a violent manner. Let's look at the history of how violent white massive resistance has been towards Blacks, Browns, and all other kinds of minority populations, if you will. But I really do believe that I am most frightened for Dr. Jackie, and I'm frightened for Timberly, because in these situations, I consider myself and have trained to be a protector. And in that regard, I do believe that the evil exists to the point where nothing is off the table. No holds are barred. We've seen it recently.
Kimberly, do you have a further comment?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Dr. Dixon and Dr. Bridgeman, particularly the part of understanding that these incidences and these things can occur with such distance in between people that it's easy to keep it in the theoretical framework, right? But this is reality, and we have to take real action to fight against it. And so I think it's important to ensure that when you're using words like racism and racist, that you are not thinking of just ideologies, but the people enacting that, right? And the structures within the university that help maintain those ideologies. And so I think just for convenience sake, in terms of I would love to hear from your perspective, if this event did come from a university student, what would the university's response have been? Because I think, we can all post press releases and send solidarity. But like I said, it's not a theoretical issue that can be solved or amended by a press release. And so I'm curious as to like if this event could have been tracked down, or if there was just proof and evidence of the tons of cases of students' individual experiences on campus that aren't broadcasted to the world. What would you all have done to stand in solidarity and attempt to create whatever you perceive as justice?
I appreciate that question. So I'll try to answer that, but I would say that I would, of course, follow whatever process we have in place in order to handle incidents like this. But of course, this was such a serious problem here that there would surely be strong action. Could be suspension if it's a student. I don't know. I'd have to, there would be processes that I'm not very familiar with how they actually operate here at the university since I'm new. But I would just say we would take every action available to us to make sure that this was handled properly. And it was, as we are currently working with the law enforcement, FBI, IT specialists, and so on, in order to take every action that we possibly can at wherever these people are who perpetrated this. So it was a horrendous event and can't be tolerated. I'll just say that. I would like to maybe come back for a minute to Jackie's comment about affirmatively committing that we make this a safe environment. So, I mean, I'm certainly prepared to say those words. I want to understand better, and maybe there aren't instant answers. I recognize this, but maybe over time we can develop a set of actions that we can begin to take that both protect people as best we can, and also I think exploring the underlying causes. I think there's a lot of racism that people carry without really even frankly being aware of it. And so, I mean, good, honest people who would say that they're not racist certainly have implicit bias. I mean, and that's just true of all of us. I mean, actually, for that matter. So having a very healthy discussion on those kinds of issues and might help begin to get some of the root causes, at least within our own community. So anyway, and any further thoughts, for example, Dr. Bridgeman, on things that you would say what it means to affirmatively commit to making this a safe environment?
So I think one piece of that, right, is to have, and I think there are different pieces of it, and I think it'll be something that we can develop over time, especially if, the university is working in dialogue with the communities and to build community. So I think there's the question of sort of, do you have protocols and procedures in place to deal with these kinds of things if and when they happen? As Dr. Dixon said, especially right now in this country, I think we're naive to think this will never happen again, or people are never going to be subject, or that, as he, I think, correctly pointed out, we can make this completely safe, right? But one of the things that was evident to me when this happened on the 15th is the university does not have clear reporting, immediate support, or response mechanisms. My email was blowing up the night of the 15th, I think in part because people didn't know where to go, but they wanted to tell somebody and they wanted someone to do something about it. And then being in those conversations after it happened, a lot of what the university has done has been ad hoc, because we really don't have procedures in place and we don't have response mechanisms. We have a code of conduct for students if it was a student, for it to go there, but that doesn't tell you where to go to get help when you're psychologically traumatized. We don't know which law enforcement to report to. We don't know, all of those. So I think just even basic things like that are non-existent at the university. And then I think there's also the question, Dr. Dixon mentioned battle fatigue and sort of this sense of community. And I think the other piece that's missing and that we've had discussions about in various areas is there's no real community to go to when this happens to you. Like, you have friends and people, have sent their solidarity comments, but So for example, my alma mater, undergrad alma mater, Stanford, it's not as though racist things never happened there, right? Or there weren't racist people there, but that institution does a much better job of building community, right? So if this were to happen there, there would be a place for folks to come together. There would be mechanisms of support. There would be places, I think, where you felt affirmed and where you knew people cared and where it was clear that despite whatever this person may do that we can't control, we support and value you. And I don't see really much of any of that at our university on the basis of a lot of different categories, right? And so those are things I think we need to build. So when these things happen, the resiliency factor is much stronger than it is right now. And you don't have to bear this burden all by yourself or internalize it.
Yes, thanks a lot. So I'm actually taking notes. I'm going to take these in and work with groups here on campus to figure out how to turn these ideas into specific actions we can take. But in any case, I'm told we have a lot of questions, so I'm going to try to move us a little faster just through answers so we can get to as many questions as we can. So Mary or Elisa, do you have the next question?
So this comes from an anonymous viewer, and the topic is how the majority can help. The question is, in a country that has become increasingly polarized, how do people who are in the privileged category, i.e. Caucasian, help you avoid this battle fatigue?
That's a very good question. So I would like to turn it to perhaps first to Fred Dixon, who brought this topic up.
I think that there are clearly defined ways to become an ally. I think we go over these time and time again, what allyship means. I think it's very interesting that when we discuss allyship from our white counterparts, there is a growing number of people joining the ranks to become part of social justice research, social justice activism, and particularly on this campus. But I think it reveals a further hypocrisy because from my understanding, there is a young white professor who's over the Black Lives Matter committee here at the University of Wyoming. So not only with the optics, but in the institutional daily rhythms, there's something very strange. And it's something that could perhaps be looked to as privilege when one really believes that allyship turns into setting the pace, guiding and leading Black efforts. So more than one person had to agree with that, particularly the young man who took the actual position. So it's something in his psychoviscera that believes that Blacks need to not only be a part of it with him, but he needs to lead the efforts. So when we think about those things on this campus, it is pretty obvious, particularly from where I sit, my vantage point, that when we move outside of the rhetoric of allyship, then there are things that concretize the hypocrisy. And when we think about social justice activism, particularly here on this campus, I think one thing we have to deal with, there's a growing number of folks who are social justice racists. They lead the efforts, they have the authority. But what happens in the long run is, as long as when we become very critical, the analysis becomes very critical, as long as that analysis doesn't squeeze on their toe, then them having the power would be said, well, I think we're going a little too far. So allyship needs to be rearranged. The definitions, more specifically, the resources, those who set the pace. I use those two examples because it is, to me, on the rise on this campus. It's normally what we call, when we have social justice activity and we have meetings and planning, it's normally the same groups of individuals.
Thanks.
So when I think about MLK DOD and their refusal to discuss Dr. Martin Luther King's growing radicalism, not as historians, because that's not their job, but the idea that they can refuse to discuss it is part of more of the questions that need to go along with allyship. So the hypocrisy of it is, for the most part, I think it becomes professionally expedient to sweep it under the rug. Because every time I mention this, I become the problem. But let's look at it. What you ignore, you empower. So that would begin, and I would ask you, President Seidel, what would that say to you when we talk about allyship and there is someone who has been placed in a position of authority over the Black Lives Matters Committee here on the University of Wyoming's campus? What would you say to that?
Well, I think you're making a very interesting point, and it's no matter, I'm not familiar with exactly how that organization is operating, but I would just say that's certainly the way it's perceived by many of you as it's a sign that there's something wrong in the way we're addressing this. So I think it's certainly healthy to have this conversation. On the allyship, I would just say that I hope that this is a process where we can ourselves here become allies in exploring these issues anyway, and to see where we can take it as a community on the campus. So I'll just say that's my commitment to you, to be an ally on these topics with you and others as we explore this activity. I'd like to, I don't want to sort of—
Hold it a second, President Seidel. I
sorry?
wanted to go back to that piece when you said the allyship, but the question that I'm asking you, does allyship automatically or routinely means that there is a governance or an authority over certain social justice issues that should be controlled by, let's say, liberals, white liberals?
Can I jump in here just for a second? Dr. Dixon, you and I have had this conversation in some ways a little bit before. You know, and one thing, not to disrupt sort of your ability to answer that question, but I think there's an issue here that comes up, and I've been thinking about it more, and it's along the lines of what Dr. Dixon's bringing up. Because on the one hand, right, folks like me and him and Timberlake cannot do all of this work. On the other hand, there is a real issue and a concern of how other people come into helping us do this work. And so on the one hand, it is problematic in a lot of ways, as Dr. Dixon is saying, to not have a Black person lead Black Lives Matter committee, right? But at the same time, if only Black people can ever do this work, we're going to be mighty tired, especially if the numbers of Black folks on this campus don't grow tremendously pretty quickly, which they're not likely going to do. And so I think the question is, how do you balance those two things? And as I think Dr. Dixon is saying, have true allyship versus what I see more and more, and maybe this is just another way to say what Dr. Dixon is saying, the people who are going to come and rescue and help you, and the people who are going to tell you how to fix your own problems, and the people who, under the guise of doing social justice work and helping you, are really furthering their own agendas or how they see the world and reinforcing that same racism. And, you know, one example of that are all the people who sent the solidarity statements, and I can only speak for myself, but I'm imagining Timberlake and Frederick and all these people got them, where it wasn't really about standing in solidarity. It was making themselves feel better because they felt bad about the incident, right? And so it wasn't, you know, I'm going to do my part to do X. It's like, I'll tell you I feel sorry for you because I'm feeling bad, and that will make me feel better. And that's not, as much as I understand the good intent there, that doesn't really move the needle. And it doesn't really, I guess, address those issues. So I think we certainly need allies, but I think there are lots of ways to be allies, and some of those are problematic and some of those are much more helpful than others. But at the same time, and I may just be tired, the same four of us can't be doing all this work all the time, everywhere by ourselves.
Right. So yeah, point well taken. And I mean, I hope actually just having an audience hearing these remarks and taking them in, and maybe at least a starting point for figuring out next steps towards this. I don't want to suppress this point because it's a very important one, but I'd like to go on to the next question because I know that I'm getting messages here. There are a lot of questions out there. So would you like Mary or Lisa to ask the next question?
The next question is from Tessa Della Rosa, and it's directed to you, President Seidel. Tessa asks, how are you going to involve white faculty and staff in this conversation so that Black people do not have to do all the work? Do you see this conversation as being important to have outside of the Wyoming Black Studies Department? And part two, are you a supporter of getting hate crime legislation in our state? And if so, what are you doing about that?
All right, so I'll take both of them. So the first one is, of course, I'm extremely supportive of involving white people and people of all backgrounds to be involved in this movement. This is not only about Black people here. Of course, tonight has largely been highlighted by the terrible events that are focused around Black people, but it's not only about that. So I just say I'm very interested in doing this. I think as you've heard, sometimes movement that we might make or appointments we might make in order to try to sort of have additional help. And so that's not just the four of you over and over again doing this, brings in white people or could bring in Asian people or other people as well. And so, and sometimes if that's not done thoughtfully, it can lead to concerns that we've just heard tonight. So I want to really take that in. So I would like to be guided by you all on the most effective steps we can take, but certainly goes way beyond the Black Studies Center or any particular center here. It's a really community-wide problem that we need to be involving or to be discussing. So on hate crime legislation, I have to confess I'm not very familiar with the kind of legislation that's being supported or being proposed. I would really like to learn about this. I'm not just punting. I want to say something thoughtful about it, but of course, I think, of course, this does potentially impact or interact with the First Amendment. So there'd be clearly very deep legal discussions as well as social discussions on how to address this. But it is absolutely unacceptable, the kinds of things we've just heard. And so I'd like to understand better how we are able to handle this. So I would like to actually, perhaps one of our legal scholars here could talk a little bit about that. Maybe you know something about the legislation that's being proposed. I personally have not been involved in it. So I would turn to Dr. Bridgeman if you have any comments on that.
I'm a legal scholar, although not necessarily a First Amendment scholar. I know there's legislation that's currently being proposed. I believe Dr. Connolly, who's a legislator and also, I hope I'm not talking out of turn there, is one of the proponents of it in the legislature, as she's one of our representatives, although I haven't seen the details of it. You know, and I think we've got other questions to get to, and a further discussion of this takes us a little off topic. But I do think when you have instances like this, one of the questions that comes up is free speech. And there's one of the ways that an incident like this gets minimized is to say, oh, it's just speech, it doesn't matter. I have been characterizing, and I think it's much more accurate, to at least with respect to these kinds of events, I think you're not as much on the margins of free speech, and I think it's much more in the vein of an actual assault, right? Which is something you can remedy with less First Amendment concerns. That's a much broader, deeper conversation, and one that gets into a lot of views of underlying history of this country and all those things. And I don't think that's where we want to go tonight. But I do think that characterizing what happened on the 15th as just a speech issue does a real disservice to how egregious that was and the effects of that particular incident. And I think an assault is a much better way to think about that. And that's something for which there should be some remedy under the law.
And for the record, I completely agree with that. And I know that a statement came out from the university mentioning the First Amendment, but not saying it protected it, saying it depending on the circumstances, it may protect it, but we would take every action we could in order to address the issue. So anyway, I think it would be an interesting topic for maybe a future discussion. Can I just turn to the next question? I just want to make sure we get to plenty of community questions here in dialogue. So
next question is from Riley Talamontes. It's regarding faculty members and race. Riley states, some faculty members may not be ready to have conversations about race. For instance, someone at Faculty Senate said that the message the university is sending about this is too negative and that we have done a great job so far with diversity. I have also known professors who think race conversations are not that big of a deal and that we should not see color or differences. Do you all have any strategies for how you approach these situations? I think it is important to recognize these issues we have in faculty members if we want to have genuine conversations about race.
Thank you, President Talamontes. That's a very good point. And in fact, I was at that discussion and I heard it. And I think I would further characterize that remark as saying, it's not like we're starting from scratch. We have done a lot on this campus and we should recognize that, but also saying that we have to go further. But the feeling was that perhaps the statement that was sent out by my office and with the backing of the board and our deans and directors and so on, sounded like we were too negative. And so it's kind of contrary to other comments that I've heard as well. So it shows the diversity of opinion about all this. So I'd really like to kind of turn that to the panel here for some commentary. I don't know, I noticed if Timberly, if you'd like to make a comment, just like to give you a chance to speak up too.
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, I would be interested in your personal response to hearing that in a meeting, especially in consideration of the other types of responses you got to the letter. But I think in regards to Riley's question, I think it's important to realize how comfortability in terms of talking about racism is extremely hard to do from the bottom up perspective in terms of students, student organizations, or even smaller groups on campus, such as multicultural affairs, even the Black Studies Center. It's much more difficult, at least from my experience, to get that point across rather than just one, inquiring if those in power, especially the president's office and other offices similar, agree with those sentiments and have it as a priority, and to implement those ideologies and comfortability when talking about those by hosting them and by leading them from yourself, right? And inviting the people most impacted and the people most curious about it to the table, but definitely not putting it on their plate to put together and host and invite you to, right? So, but I am interested in, when hearing that, you know, in terms of the letter being too mean, or focusing on the positives that the university has achieved, I would just like to hear what your perspective is on what those successes have been, especially when you consider retention of not only students of color, but faculty and staff of color. I think you can have a million events put on campus. You can have MLK Days of Dialogue every year. You can have Black History Month events every year. But those aren't necessarily addressing and solving the problems that we are facing. I think at least the root of these problems, which I think lies in policy and institutional structure.
Yeah, those are really good points. And so I'll try to take a couple of them and then maybe get some other commentary from the rest of our panelists here. But excuse me, I reacted to that comment, by the way, by saying that, of course, I haven't been here, so I don't know all of the things that have been achieved. But I take it for granted as true that there has been a lot of effort and some things have been done well, even though that doesn't say that there aren't many things to do and that other things were done poorly and so on. So basically what I said was saying that we still have a lot of work to do here, is not inconsistent with saying that we've done some things well in the past. And so that was basically how I reacted. At the same time, you point out some really good numbers. For example, our retention and graduation rates for students of color here are significantly worse. There are big achievement gaps there. So clearly we can do a lot better. And it's one of my major priorities going forward to find out what things we can do better to address that. And I mean, and that statement goes for all students, but certainly for students of color, it's a bigger problem, and we have to really take that on and seriously take that on. I think we also have to be very serious about making sure we're extremely purposeful about finding excellent candidates for jobs and having them in positions so that people in minority groups here can feel that they have mentors and they have people that they can identify with, people like them, and that's well known to address, not maybe to address, but to improve success rates among students who are in diverse groups and so on. So I'm committed to looking at those kind of things very seriously and seeing what we can do there. But I'd invite both of you professors here to make a comment, and then I'd like to go to the next question.
I'm not surprised that there is a group of professors, staff, faculty, students who really believe that perhaps your way of addressing this horrific event was too strong. Because when we think about the power of learned behaviors, we think about how people bring from their most intimate settings and from their learned behaviors as young as they can recall, that there is a separation on this arc of humanity and where they sit and where, let's say directly, where Blacks sit. And from there comes actions, attitudes, and behaviors. So if someone were to say that perhaps that was too strong, well, another look, or from another lens, I didn't see the word race in the first response at all. So I thought it was overly looked at to not have addressed it directly. And I'm sure that that in itself shows the differences in how people interpret things. But I think it also goes directly to white privilege. So imagine that same professor in a classroom and that came up and the topic was discussed. Imagine how that discussion would go. Imagine how some of those students in that classroom would feel after let's think about what would come from his thoughts, what would come from her thoughts. And I think it happens all the time. And there's a part of this that is protected institutionally. So I think there is a institutional protecting around being non-productive on the issues of race that makes the authorities and those in the top brass seek justifications that keep you non-productive on the issues of race. But it has to be supported by those same thoughts that you just mentioned. So I do believe that there is a significant portion. Now, for someone to get up and say it in a Senate faculty meeting, that is showing an outward manifestation of the gall that it takes to find allies on that same kind of mindset. So I think it's par for the course. I think it's business as usual. And I think it in itself brings about a very clear understanding about the way that white privilege permeates higher education, particularly here.
Understood. Jackie, do you want to add anything to it, or should we go to another question?
Yeah, I'll just say real quick. I think it's evidence of a lot of the things we're talking about and why people don't feel safe on this campus and why finding allies is difficult. And I had heard some of those comments. And, one of the questions I think I have, and I'd sort of pose to the community, is why are we so resistant, or is there pushback for having a strong statement over such a horrific event? And why do you think you're in a position to determine whether it was strong or adequate when it didn't happen to you, and when you aren't the one who has to live with that experience? And what does that say about where we are? And as Dr. Dixon said, what that privilege looks like. And that minimizing it is part of what makes people feel devalued and makes people think, this isn't a safe place for me, because something that horrific can happen and we can't even say strongly that it was horrific. So there's that issue. I think the other piece of that, with respect to the fact that we've done diversity work and it's gotten better. We could debate over the degree to which we all agree with that statement. But I think the underlying assumption there is, if we do it, it's good enough, which means then if you're still subject to these kinds of things, then you have to live with it. And how dare you demand that we do better so that you don't have to perhaps run the risk of being assaulted when all you're trying to do is your job. And so, in that respect, at least from my perspective, and I'm sure this wasn't necessarily that person's intent, but what you're really saying is what we're doing is good enough. And if you have to carry this extra burden, so be it, right? Why should the university be held to do better when there are places of improvement?
Right. Well, I would just say I'm committed to finding ways to do better. And I think it was a heartfelt remark, actually, but I think it does illustrate some of the exact issues you're talking about. And so anyway, I'm committed to doing better. And this will be part of the dialogue we have. So I'd like to move on then to the next question, if it's all right, Mary.
Sorry, I had to unmute. Yes, the next question comes from Tanner Ewalt, and the subject is the immediate response after the attack. Why did the university immediately say that it wasn't students? We all know that racism is alive and well on this campus. Why does the university hide behind diversity programs as a shield while taking little or no action?
Well, I mean, I'll just speak for myself and what I know our office is doing, and also the many offices at the university. The reason we said it wasn't students was because we did a deep forensic investigation, and at least we had no evidence that it was students, and that there were very similar attacks of the same, apparently the same group at other universities across the nation with similar techniques, also with the servers that were where the attacks were relayed from, actually coming from outside the country. Of course, that doesn't mean that they originated in Germany. For example, a server was identified as being in Germany. That was part of it, as well as another server on the East Coast, up in the Northeast. So we merely were reporting what we had learned. It wasn't in any sense to try to hide or sort of say that the campus is not full of problems that we're all talking about tonight. So it was merely trying to relay information that we had. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that or any aspect of that, but let's move on to the next question then. Mary, do you have another one?
Next one is also anonymous. The topic is university and hate crime legislation. President Seidel, will members in your cabinet be working with the Wyoming Legislature or the City Council in addressing hate crime legislation?
Well, I want to explore this a little bit more. I would say we have had conversations in the last week, even with the City Council of Laramie on a number of issues. Initially, that particular meeting was focused on economic development aspects, but I think that's another approach that we can take, which around economic development. As some of you know, I sometimes frame the importance of diversity and inclusion around innovation and economic development. And if we can work on some of the root causes of the inequities that we have and have people from different groups, income groups, races, et cetera, working together on economic development issues, that is one approach. I mean, I'm not saying it's everything we can do, but that was one of the topics we had with the city. So I'm just saying that we will have conversations around all manner of things, and so we certainly will work with the General Counsel's office and Government Affairs and others to see what's appropriate for the university to do to help support legislation that might help us. I'm only saying that because I'm in sort of a non-committal way on specific legislation, since I don't know what's in it, but it's certainly a topic that I'm happy to talk about. All right, next question, since that one was directed to me.
The next question is from Anna Rader. Oh, no, let me skip that one. I'm sorry. She requested, I'm going to skip that one. Amber Hoover about curriculum. I thank Dr. Dixon, Dr. Bridgeman, and Dr. Vogel from the bottom of my heart. Thank you to all who are helping to make this town hall happen tonight. I acknowledge the racist structure that I benefit from. I would like to discuss curriculum that would begin in kindergarten, that would be carried through graduate education, a curriculum that could be created at the University of Wyoming.
Well, that's a really interesting idea. So I've been promoting the idea of K-12 computer science education. I've been talking about innovation education. So those are sort of just, window dressing almost to what you're talking about, which I think we ought to really have a conversation about. So I don't know if there are currently any efforts on campus to really consider that, but I'd certainly like to hear about it.
Yeah, I can speak to that. As one of my many hats, I'm chairing the Next Gen Committee, and then I'm also on Inclusive Pillars. I can't speak to K through 12, right? And I think that curriculum happens in other places. Although in the past, I have been part of efforts, this has been a while ago now, where research groups tried to work with some K through 12 teachers on how to at least teach some history courses at least better, or more inclusively. So I think there are sort of one-off things like that that have happened. But in terms of this campus, one of the things that came up in the Inclusive Pillar Committee meeting, one of the things that has come up, although we haven't met that much yet, in the Next Gen Committee, which will be formulating the new USP, so general education requirements for the university, has been embedding that in the required education, right? These courses on cultural competency and on knowledge development related to diversity and things like that. And so I certainly think it's important for all the reasons we're talking about here. My sense is from conversations in both those committees that those committees are committed to that as well. So I think those things are in development. And then of course, within the School of Culture, Gender, and Social Justice, that's what we do. So we have those conversations all the time. And so although not required of everyone on this campus, that education is certainly available to anybody. And of course, we welcome folks to come and take those courses. And there are many of those that are taught within our school and in other places on campus, not necessarily affiliated with us as well.
I'd like to just take the prerogative as the kind of convener here to say, to ask a question myself, because this just reminds me of something. So I've been talking with some of the planning groups here around strategic planning of the idea of living learning communities, that where we might have, for example, a dormitory that is focused on some cohort of students, regardless of whether they're a physics major, an English major, or engineering, or what have you, but perhaps around different topics. And we have these proposals for grand challenge themes, and one of them is on social equity. And I like very much the idea that we might even have a cohort of students with a faculty member that helps lead discussions and seminars and so on, starting with freshman year. And I just wonder if people think, what people think about that idea, if that would be helpful, if that would be an effective thing to do. Just thoughts on that.
I'm going to jump in real quick and then I'll shut up and let other people talk. Just because this, when you mentioned that, it brought up another idea. I like that idea. I like the idea of inculcating these things in the campus. I think one thing we have to be careful about, though, is when you're doing education on these issues, there seems to be a tendency, and I know this came up in the discussion we had in our committee, to think that anybody and everybody can do this. And I think we have to be careful to make sure that when we're putting in these learning opportunities and educational experiences, that you're relying on people with expertise in the area who know what they're doing. You know, I think the comment I made in our committee meeting is you don't get a political scientist to teach biology. But for some reason, we seem to think anybody can teach anything diversity related. So I think as we do that, we have to be careful about that and to make sure that, you know, you're relying on people who have actual expertise and know what they're doing as you're building those things. I think you also have to be careful, as was brought up in our meeting, I thought quite astutely, to, like all these things we're talking about, it not do it on the backs of the marginalized communities that you're talking about, right? Where people aren't singled out in the classes and where they become the spokesperson for everybody and all of those things. So I would just put that as a caveat as these things move forward, to be really careful about that as they're being developed.
That's a really good point. I'll just tell you an anecdote, just reminds me of something. When I was at the National Science Foundation, I would have to testify before Congress from time to time. And I found I rarely got challenged on like physics programs we had, although I did want to get challenged quite strongly by a PhD physicist in Congress on one of those programs. But every single person in Congress has had an education, and they all have ideas on what we should be doing and so on. So, I mean, it's a similar kind of idea. So I agree totally with your point. We have to think through that very carefully. But I would hope that that would be at least one dimension of how we could begin to address the sort of communities of people here on the campus and begin to educate them, particularly as they come in as freshmen or first-year students and so on. So let me turn, unless there's another comment on that, I'd like to turn to more questions. I'm assuming that we have quite a few more. Is that right, Mary?
We do. We have, I think, 17 more questions, and they keep coming in. This next question's from River Hyde. It's about the town hall. River states, I fear UW will have this town hall and make a commitment to change and then fail to follow through for the years to come. What will you all be doing to ensure this is a lasting change? What will you be doing to ensure that marginalized communities will feel safe at UW in the next decade?
I really appreciate that question. And I tell you, so as some of you will know, I've attended a few meetings where people have made the same kinds of remarks. Well, you know, we've been here for 20 years. I've been on 5 working groups starting in 1990 something, and, you know, a lot of good ideas, and then nothing has really changed. And I do think, first of all, I'm committed to making this a long-term set of activities that begin to get to some of the root causes as we can identify them, and if we can find remedies that we're capable of implementing. I'm committed to trying to do that, and also to try to find the resources that are needed to do it. I mean, you know, just noting that we're not flowing in money, but we're going to do what we can. There can be organizational changes, there can be programmatic changes, there can be things that cost money, and we'll devote what we can to it, and we will try to find resources from outside the university. There are foundations and there are agencies like NSF and others. So there are things we can do. And so I'm committed to working not just to have a feel-good meeting tonight, but in the long term. And I've said that to some of the committees who also said to me, well, what are you going to do that's different? Well, I mean, I'm planning to be here for a while, and I want to stick this out. And it's not just me. I think a lot of us are really committed to this. And so I just commit to exactly that program. This is not a one-time thing or a one semester thing. It's something we're here for the long term for.
Well, President Seidel, is very interesting. And I wanted to ask you on a top of that question, if you will. When you say long term, is that interchangeable with gradualism?
No, no, not at all.
Okay.
There are things we can do
Because
tomorrow.
I know that there is a acute intoxication with gradualism.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, as a scholarly term, I can imagine what that means, but what it conveys to me is no. I'm not saying we'll plan on doing something in 3 years. We'll do what we can now. We do it more, you know, next month, and then we'll do more next fall, and so on. So that's the way I see it. All right, next question.
I'm going to combine a few questions, President Seidel, because I have about 5 individuals who have put this same point forward. Mm-hmm. And it's for yourself and also the panelists. All of it revolves around employment. What can the university do to take seriously complaints or issues that employees have with their bosses, supervisors, managers at UW who are saying and doing racist and homophobic things? Employees get evaluated, but we aren't allowed to evaluate superiors. Having a form that we can fill out with these incidents would be a great way to feel like we're reaching out anonymously and hopefully get a follow-up email and a way to get these actions taken care of. And let me move on and add something from another, and all of these are anonymous questions. On the same line from another employee who said they're relatively new, started in January of 2020. Their first 2 months were horrible, but they decided to move past it. They're over a year in, and I'm in the middle of other job interviews because of what the panelists have expressed tonight. It would be easier for me to stay at UWYO and grow, but the racism has now permeated my physical health, and I know you want to increase retention among faculty, staff of color, and underrepresented communities. So what can you say tonight that will help me feel supported, something I can hold on to for the short term?
Well, I will just say, and I'm hoping the others who have been here longer can tell me what processes there are that are actually in place to address these issues. I mean, I'm most familiar with the same kinds of issues, but around the theme of sexual harassment and gender-based harassment, where there are very clear procedures and policies in place to begin to address it. And so I'm assuming that there are similar processes in place around racist and homophobic comments and that kind of treatment that people receive here. I would like to get some better understanding from some of you who've been here for a while, like what are the processes in place, and if there's any advice to the several people that apparently asked that question. But I will personally look into this and understand better what's in place, and then understand what kind of things we need to take a look at. But would either any of the three of you want to comment specifically on this?
I'll take that one in part because in my other life I was an employment lawyer, right? And I've been involved in drafting some policies in some ways over the years here. And I think, you know, and I made the comment before that we didn't have infrastructure in place to deal with the particular incident on February 15th. I think we, in general, don't have good infrastructure and ability in place to deal with these things. And as I've said in other venues at other times, I think one of the places where we're running into trouble at this university is when we have talked about these things and these incidents have arisen, we have focused on whether they're legally actionable, and have often taken the approach that if they're not legally actionable, meaning, you know, someone could win a lawsuit over them, they're not addressable. Or, you know, there's not much the university can do. And my take on that, and from my perspective of legal training, but not everybody, of course, agrees with me, is that what's legally addressable is the floor. And you can certainly do more than that, right? So you can, there are other things you can do beyond that to address those issues, right? The law tells you what you can't do. It says very little about what you can do, right? And there are some parameters there, but you can affirmatively take steps to try to address issues, even if it may not be actionable under the law to fire somebody, or they might win a lawsuit. And I think our whole orientation to these problems has not been correct. And that's why a lot of them aren't addressed. And there are many people, and I know of a number of people who have left this university for similar issues. They may not have been able to win a lawsuit, but their legitimate complaints and problems certainly were not addressed or not addressable. And it goes to that building that safe environment. I think it's all part of the same conversation, and one that we need to continue to have, because I think there's more work to be done there.
Can I ask a question that kind of builds on that? Is it a feeling, or is it even demonstrably so, that the conditions here are worse than, say, in other institutions like ours in this way? I mean, for example, other universities?
I think there are some aspects that are ubiquitous, but I think there's an insulation here in Wyoming and the University of Wyoming that is somewhat unique in higher ed. And I think it's a reflection of the community. I think it's a reflection of what's important with the community members, even when we begin to say the world needs more cowboys. That says a lot about what is important to those who have authority to make that a slogan. And I think that's outward. I think that allows for a great analysis and critique. But I know folks have been complaining for years about the slogan, and it is still the slogan. So it says a lot to me.
Kimberly, as you're shaking your head there, did you have a comment you wanted to make on that?
No, I totally agree. And I think we're getting ahead of ourselves by asking if we are comparing ourselves to other universities, because we are sure that we have a problem when incidences like the 15th happen. But even if you have one student complaint or report about this, that shows that there's a problem, regardless of how many times it happens in CSU or any other comparable school. I think it's just important to, one, especially for your office, to talk to these students and reach out to these students specifically that don't have a way of reporting it, don't know how to report it, don't feel comfortable reporting it, but still, in conversation will share their experiences, share why they feel unsafe. And so I think it's we're putting the wagon in front of the horse to start comparing ourselves, because we know that there's an issue and we haven't done much to address it.
Right. So, I mean, I take your point. No matter how we rank, we have work to do here regardless. I mean, perhaps that's your main point, but it's disturbing to me if people feel that they can go to other universities, for example, where they won't face these kinds of issues. So that's another thing for me to really begin to understand here. No, you're saying no, Fred.
I'm saying that when it comes to ubiquitous problems in higher ed, I don't understand. I take the same vein that Timberly does. The here and now problems that need to be addressed here, it seems to be far more salient than how we look at other institutions to allow some sort of understanding that we are better than the next institution, or maybe we're not as good as the institution, when our problems are direct and specific, and we still have a lot of complexities with addressing them directly and specifically.
Right. I was getting more at maybe there are things we could learn if there are best practices that somehow could be just adopted or at least modified in some way to be applied here. But in any case, the point is really well taken. We have work to do internally regardless, but I do want to look around as we look to remedies for problems we have, if there are things we can learn. All right, let me move on to the next question then. Mary, what would be the next one?
President Seidel, let me provide you 2 comments. Neither of these are questions. Both want to be anonymous on this topic. One commenter says to Dr. Dixon, yes, absolutely. The world needs more cowboys is very questionable. We need to be educators in this community. We are the only state without hate crime legislation and the only state that does not take in refugees. The other one says, I would like to second the idea that many of our superiors are not on board with this conversation. I would like an evaluation form for our superiors. I have actively brought up that we need to discuss Black Lives Matter and how racism affects all our students, and have been told to be quiet. And then the last piece of this conversation was part 2 of what you guys just discussed, which is you, the panelists, have mentioned all these committees and groups and et cetera. So why isn't it working and doing its job to support employees like myself? I'm tired of listening to pillars and committees if it's not going to work as intended.
Okay, I hear those comments. I mean, maybe just have a moment on the last one. I get it that somebody new comes in and says, well, we're going to have a process, we're going to do things differently and so on. And people say, well, I've seen this before. And so, I try to earn your respect on this one. And I recognize it'll take actions, not just meetings and words, but I'm listening and I'm taking it in. I'm taking notes. I have a whole lot of notes here. So there will be a cabinet meeting tomorrow morning. We will start to discuss some of these things and we'll go further. So I promise you that.
So
I'd
the
like to
next,
make a quick comment. Sorry, Mary, to interrupt you. Just in terms of hate crime bills, and if you choose to start doing research into that, I would heavily urge you to reach out to the community organizations and nonprofits that have been paying attention to this bill for many months now, rather than just talking to representatives for it. Just at least from my experience and personally with Laramie Human Rights Network, there are a number of organizations in Laramie and in Cheyenne that have talked to Kathy O'Connelly and other representatives considering bringing this bill and sharing concerns. And so I would just urge you, if that is something that you end up putting on your plate or wanting to get the university to stand for or against, to ensure that you're getting commentary and insight from the people that would be most impacted and or protected or not protected from that hate crime bill if it were to pass.
We'll follow this up. Thanks. Okay, next question.
The next question is from Dimitri Plummer. His topic is solutions for combating racism on campus. His statement: we're having a conversation about race and systems of power and the steps which the university can take to address a systemic problem of racism which we have derived to exist. I helped with the protests over the summer, and one of our primary goals was police reform, as the police represent a poignant imposition of power on the populace. Despite massive budget cuts to the university, the UW police keep a healthy budget, even though Laramie as a community has 2 police forces who patrol it otherwise. How can you justify the existence of the UW police despite our community calls for police reform and their self-reported lack of effectiveness in matters other than drug and alcohol-related issues among the student body?
Well, I'll start again with this one, since this is, I think, largely directed to me. So, but I'd like comments from others on this topic, because particularly you have perspective, having been here, that I'm only just now acquiring. I would just say there are different issues that the campus police deal with than the city police, although there's overlap and there's cooperation between them as well. And I found in my experience here, having been here just over 6 months, a very cooperative and thoughtful campus police activity. And I've met with Chief Samp. I've been at, for example, there was a very, very interesting discussion with the my first week here, actually, in my first week in the job, between the athletics program and Laramie PD about some of these issues. And that's in fact where I first met Fred, who was sitting next to me. We sort of recognized each other. We have a common connection at the University of Illinois. And so I would just say that I've heard this a number of times, that we should look into this. I would be guided by what the actual practice of our force is and how they're doing. And I know that there are anecdotes, and there are people who've said, well, we need to defund this and that, especially with our budget problems. And I'll just say that I want to be guided in any sort of decisions we make, or any sort of discussions on what's the truth on the ground in terms of how things are performing and what we really need. So that's the basic point I would make about this. And in my own experience as an undergraduate, I can tell you, I got to know the chief of police on my campus, and that's not a good thing. And so I would just say, I'm very glad it was the chief of police of the College of William and Mary police, rather than the city police of Williamsburg, Virginia, because I think that there was an understanding there of the campus culture. And I felt, actually, in that case, thankful that I met with that group. So there were differences of approaches that I think we should make sure that we at least understand it, that we need, or if we don't for some reason, then we should look in further into what to do. But I'm just going on about this, but I'm just saying I have some personal experience, and I want to make sure that we do the right thing on this going forward, but to be guided by what we need.
I'd like to add to tomorrow at 5:30 p.m. the Black Studies Center will be having a discussion that directly challenges the mainstream narrative about police defunding, with Chief Samp, with Apple Hands, and folks across the country who will have different perspectives about defunding and the police. And that'll be hosted by Timberly Vogel. So we are speaking as the Black Studies Center. And if you paid attention to our theme, if you paid attention to our endeavors, we spoke directly from the standpoint theory, those who were the most marginalized. We spoke to it, what I think, in an efficient, creative manner. But what we put on the table, you'll see in our very last programmatic effort of the month. So I think you'll find that very interesting. I think it will come outside of the dominant narrative, and hopefully that will be a rich conversation. But please join, tune in. There'll be a way that you can inject your conversation and your questions. But look forward to that tomorrow night, 5:30 p.m. with Timberly Vogel hosting.
Thank you. And if I can, I'd like to build off of Dimitri's question, because I tuned into the town hall or the ASUW meeting last night, and I took some notes about how you were talking about the need to acquire funding in order to help address some of these issues. I think specifically with retainment of faculty and staff of color, ensuring programs like the Black Studies Center, Multicultural Affairs, the Native American Center have the resources they need to provide the programming and educational programs that they can do. And so I, of course, was very heavily involved in these processes of looking at what the university is spending money on and what the university, what's first on the chopping block, which this summer seemed to be the MFA for creative writing. And so that's by no means new in terms of programs, one being cut or faculty and staff being cut just because of these contentious financial times. And so I'm curious, if not a program or an entity like LPD or like UW-PD that ultimately can have its responsibilities spread to already existing structures within our community, where do we look for that funding to maintain and ensure that these not only educational programs, but these programmings, programs like Multicultural Affairs, the Black Studies Center, where are we going to look for funding then to ensure that these programs stay on campus, if that's a priority to you over others?
And we're going to be looking at how those reviews turn out in terms of how many students are involved, how effective are they, if there's scholarship involved, is there excellence in the scholarship, and the usual ways that you sort of evaluate programs. That information will be taken along with all the strategic planning to understand what things we really can't continue to do and what things we need to focus on. So that's just like a high level description of the overall review process and how we'll arrive at decisions. Now, some things are going to be very strategic, and I've said from last June that one of the 4 pillars here is inclusion, and so there will be a high priority assigned to things that help support the development of an inclusive and welcoming, diverse campus. And so I just want to say that it's not merely does something turn out to do well in terms of some dimension of a review process, but there are priorities we're going to have as well. So this is a priority area for us. And it's also, there are many reasons for it. Maybe I don't want to launch into a long speech about why this particular pillar is so important, but I'm calling it a pillar because I think it helps create a vibrant community. It allows us to innovate. It allows us to have people from all different areas of life. That makes the campus much more alive, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's so many reasons why that this is important. Now, about funding, we are going to have to stop doing some things. I can't predict right now what they are because the process is being carried out right now. However, for things that we have priority and we have lack of funding, we will search the country for sources of funding, whether it's through foundations, through philanthropy, through programs at funding agencies from the federal government, could be from the National Science Foundation, or it could be from an Economic Development Authority, or you name it, but we will be looking for these things. There are lots of foundations out there. I found that the university has been more dependent on state funding than being, when I say the university needs to be more entrepreneurial, it's about looking for things, hustling for things that we think are really important to us. And this is, I think, one of the areas where we can find some funding for things. That's all general statements, but I'm committed to doing what's possible to address your question in more detail.
And just to clarify, will that process of going through the programs and their efficiency and benefit to the campus, that's what I got from that, will these programs that lay outside of education also be reviewed comparable to UW-PD? I mean, if that even gets into like sanitation and things of that matter.
I think we'll look at those things too, but the process I'm talking about with the strategic planning review is primarily focused on academic programs. But so we're looking at everything. So there's the academic side of the house where largely the process I've been talking about lies. But then there's, of course, all kinds of things, including centralization of services that we may be able to find efficiencies in finding centralized services around, dining and such things on the campus. And so we'll be looking at everything. And so if anyone has suggestions about things that either ought to be priorities or their cost savings or there are areas or ideas about how to achieve funding for things that we think are priorities, we're all open for all these ideas. Okay, next question. I guess we've got about 20 minutes left. So but I suspect we have more than 20 minutes of questions. So Mary,
we do. So from Donald Bellamy, his topic is calling out racism and bigotry and also change. He asks, why does it feel like every time we have these dialogues about racism and bigotry, we appear not to make systemic change? Good recommendations are made and then slowly ignored. We can't just let changes be set aside due to excuses. It should never be an excuse when compared to the real harm systemic racism causes and the beliefs that prevail at this university. It is not just about remedying this wrong, but addressing the bigger picture. He then goes on with a specific comment to President Seidel saying, are you willing to stand up to those who may oppose your changes that could help inclusivity and curtail the culture of racism? We had a previous president who was voted out when she also was trying to make changes. Is this a risk you are willing to take?
Well, I'm here. My career has been around change in every place that I've worked, I would say, and so this is no different. And this is my last planned stop in my career. So I am committed to doing what we need to do to move this campus forward, and this is an important part of that. So I'll put it at that. So, but it's my intention to work extremely hard to make us, as I said, a best-in-class 21st century land-grant university, and innovation and diversity is absolutely critical to that. I'll give you an example. I think there are a lot of reasons why I think it's not just that I'm committed to this, because the previous presidents have been committed to it as well, and I'm sure that they were all completely dedicated to it, and not just presidents, but others in the university as well. But this does feel really to me like a moment of change at a national level. And I think that there's something different about it. It's sort of like the last movement that was in any way, I think, comparable to what we've been experiencing this last year was in the 60s in the civil rights movement. And I really feel that this is a sustained movement. It's one that has broad support across the country. And it's been a bit smothered by these other issues, COVID-19 and so, issues in Washington and budget issues and so on. But I just think that this is another time in history that we can push very hard on. And I hope that we become not only a thought leader on this campus at a statewide and national level, but also a place that begins to take actions that we can take. I mean, there are a lot of things we can't address. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of years of history that got us to this point. So we can't fix everything, but we can do what we can on this campus.
Can you speak to the Board of Trustees' interest in developing that systemic change or just joining in on conversations like this town hall?
Oh, I think there would be eagerness to do that. I think we have a very good Board of Trustees, a lot of interest in helping to support the kinds of changes we're talking about on the campus. I mean, so I have a number of things that I'm personally pushing on, and then working with working groups across the campus to develop their ideas and plans as well. So, but I think the board is all in. So that would be a great idea if some board members would like to join us in a conversation like this. I suspect there would be interest.
One thing I'll throw out real quick along those lines, having been one of those people that's been involved in this for probably way too long on this campus, is I do think this time around, we really, if we're going to actually make significant systemic change, we've got to dig down and start looking at the systems and the way we do business on a whole lot of levels. I think the approach that we've taken, and even some of the conversations, even the comment about the progress we've made so far, I think speaks to this, is we've taken this approach that generally we do pretty well and we just need to tweak here and there. And I think we really need to rehaul how we do a number of things if in fact we're going to actually make transformative systemic change. So I'll just throw that out, because I think sometimes people are on board when they think, yeah, we'll tweak around the edges and we'll do a few things and it'll be fine. And I think what we're talking about here is something much more fundamental than that if we're really going to do this well. And we have to commit to those fundamental changes, which are going to require, I think, a little bit more reckoning and a lot more introspection than perhaps some folks are ready for. Because you've got to look and say, wow, we thought we were doing well, or we intended to do well, and we really aren't. And we really do have some significant problems that we need to address. And recognizing and coming to terms with that may not make us feel very good in the short term. But I think that's one of the things that's going to have to happen if we really are going to get past the lip service stage and the tweaking stage and do something fundamentally effective.
So I'm totally open to big ideas about what we should be doing at the campus that's different and not just incremental change. And there are models out there. So I'm not saying this is the best model, but just one I'm familiar with is Arizona State University. Over a period of about 15 years, it moved from really a regional university in Arizona to a national university that increased its student body significantly, increased the diversity of the student body significantly, increased the rate of retention and graduation very significantly through very different approaches to higher education. So I think there's some lesson we can learn there, and from others. Georgia State's and other universities have made very, very significant changes and growth in particularly in retention, graduation, diversity metrics. So I think that there are things we could do here that are not just icing on the cake, or changes incremental, but things we can do much more deep. I'm really open to hearing from you all about what those ideas are. All right, we're down to 21 questions. And so I have a message here from Mary. I think just given how, I know that there's a lot of interest, but I don't want to really prolong this too much beyond the 8 o'clock hour, which is the program time. So let's see where we can get to up until 8 o'clock. And then it seemed like there's enough interest that we should schedule another one of these going forward. I'm happy to stay a couple more minutes, but I just want to be mindful of people's time tonight. There may be other commitments. So Mary, would you like to take the next question?
Yes, this is from Benny Boyd, whose subject states, "What now?" I am a football coach here and relatively new to the university. I was a panelist on February 15th and have worked to process this incident since it occurred. I worry that had this not been a public event that drew so much attention toward the university, it would be swept under the rug. My 20 plus years in higher education and 40 plus years as a Black man have shown me this. My question for President Seidel is, what is the plan moving forward to ensure we don't get a boys will be boys reaction? A strongly worded email doesn't help myself and other marginalized groups feel safe. What tangible steps are being taken to ensure that the next time this occurs, there is actions to make those impacted feel safe?
Well, first of all, my heart goes out to you for having to actually have been in that event. And I know probably all of you here, or at least on the panel, witnessed that. I'll just say again that I saw it the next morning, and I was alerted initially by a student who sent me a text message and said, you need to know about this, and here's what happened. And I couldn't have been more shaken watching it. So, and I know that if it hadn't happened in such a public event, we wouldn't necessarily be having this conversation now. And maybe we would have, but it's certainly at the least, it has highlighted this in a very public way. That sort of is a call to action that I've heard quite loud and clear. And I'm here to listen. So the other parts of your question or comment are kind of along the lines of, what specifics are you prepared to take? Actions are you prepared to take? And so, I mean, I'm collecting up, I've got 4 pages of notes here so far of things to follow up on. I'm sure there will be more ideas. So my promise to you is that we'll be collecting ideas, and we will have a dialogue that continues, but not just a feel-good dialogue, but one that leads to programs that we think we can try to operationalize. So I know that's not a very specific answer to your question, but I mean, we already heard from Jackie that that we may be lacking in some basic process and procedures about what do we do? What's the sort of the chain of actions that occur if something happens? Then what do we do next? And so to make sure that these things are all very well understood, and it could well be that there many of them are in place, but just not very well practiced or understood, or in any case, we'll find ways to address these issues over time. All right, next question.
This is anonymous. It states, I am a non-traditional undergrad and call Laramie my hometown. I am also a mother of a biracial child. I have chosen to pursue my graduate degree outside of Wyoming because of the lack of diversity at the university and in the town of Laramie. Due to the size of the town and the size of the university, it is obvious that the University of Wyoming has a major influence on the community. I believe the university needs to take a stronger stand against racism, racist acts, and the overall ignorance that breeds within the University of Wyoming community. I also believe that the university is responsible for helping educate their students, faculty, and staff. One idea would be requiring a multicultural course, African American studies, Chicano studies, etc., for every freshman, sophomore as graduation requirement. Other ideas would be to hold more multicultural events on campus, putting more money towards diversity training education for the UW community as a whole, and add a zero tolerance for racism and hate statements to all UW branding and communications.
Well,
Dr. Bridgeman, were you in the conversation the other day about that suggestion about the required education requirements on diversity?
Are you referring to the one that happened in the inclusive pillars?
Yes.
Yes, I was in on that one.
I just thought you might want to share some of that conversation with this individual.
So yeah, there's certainly a lot of support in that committee for having an education requirement. And of course, in the little bit of time we had to discuss it, how that rolls out and what it looks like wasn't clear, but I think definitely one of the things, I don't know that I can speak for the committee, but it seemed, at least from that conversation, that one of the strong recommendations that's likely to come out of that and that strategic plan is that that kind of requirement, multicultural diversity, whatever you want to call it, will be embedded and required in this curriculum. I think the question is how it gets done, the degree to which it gets done, and what it looks like. I think there are different, the other piece of that conversation is I think there are different kinds of educational experiences. You know, there's sort of the co-curricular, how do you deal with people not like you? And then there's the fundamental educational piece, which I liken to learning math or something else like that. And I think we need to do both and recognize that they're not necessarily the same thing. So I think we'll probably be moving in that direction. But once again, it goes back to that question, what are the next steps? How do you do that? How long does it take to get that implemented and all those things?
Right, but I appreciate the sort of the move towards concrete suggestions of things we could do, and I attended that conversation, at least the first part of it yesterday or a couple of days ago, I forget what, anyway, earlier this week, and it was quite a healthy discussion. There really wasn't a conversation about should we do it or not. It was what would be the most effective thing that we could do, and what at what year would we put that into the curriculum? Should it be freshman level? Should it be senior level? Should it be seniors and juniors helping to educate freshmen? I mean, there are a lot of different ideas, and so then it gets down to what are the most effective things we can do, as opposed to just things that seem like good ideas. But we're taking inventory of good ideas and figuring out how to actionize them. All right, next comment, question.
The next question is anonymous, and the topic is the Board of Trustees. The question is, what does the Board of Trustees think of this event? And is the university itself working on getting the Board of Trustees group to look and be more diverse?
Well, I'll just say there are certainly members of the board that are passionate about these issues for sure. And so we've had conversations there, and course, the governor is the person who appoints the board. And so I would just say that there are, I'm sure there are conversations that I'm not in right now, but on what is the makeup of the board going forward. And so these are our natural conversations. I will tell you, I was in a Russian university at one time, and the board was composed of all white men. And I thought that was, they're trying to build frankly, an innovation university, and I made quite a big deal about saying that we are not only exemplifying innovation at this university with this board, but we are we're going to fall into the pitfalls of people all looking at things the same way. And so again, this comes back to my diversity leads to better ideas and better innovation. So anyway, I'm just saying that it's a common discussion, I think, just not just about our board, but just generally boards and what's the makeup of a board in order to be an effective steward of the organization that they're overseeing. So I know there are conversations like this that are going on, but I would just say, I know that there are board members here who are, and in fact, I'm sure they all feel this way, but some are particularly passionate and thoughtful about these issues. And so we'll have these conversations.
The next question is from Jacqueline Wara, and her topic is effective allyship. Many people would like to be your allies or already consider themselves allies, but may be afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing in their allyship. Fear is not an excuse to not being an ally, of course, but I think people yearn for guidance on how to be the best ally they can be. What do the panelists recommend people do or think about to become their effective allies? What can the university do to educate students and faculty about allyship? Would a mandatory class on racism and allyship be beneficial?
I love that question. I hope my panelists have some good thoughts on that, because these are topics that you brought up. So do you have any help for people who are thinking about how they can become good allies?
Well, I believe we can challenge what I've seen as a mainstream traditional idea of what allyship has become. And if allyship, and we've mentioned this early, if allyship means that you eventually become the authority or author over, go back to what we used as an example, over Black Lives Matter, then that's incorrect. That is in itself more of what we've known and what we see as far as when resources are allocated, when ideas become aligned in a list with a higher priority. So I think when you become an ally, one thing becomes very important. You may have to take orders, or you may have to be able to discuss things with people that you believe that you're smarter than, and be a part of a groundbreaking idea that doesn't necessarily have you in leadership. So I'm very used to, like, when we see certain things and they begin to evolve, particularly when it comes to allyship. And I'll give you something that may be able to put it in a very concrete manner. When we think about allyship, particularly when it comes to Black Lives Matter, when we think about our brethren who are other than Black, let's say our white brothers and sisters, the one thing that makes it very clear is that, think about being in a church. It's good that you're in the church, but you don't need to be in the first pew. So in many ways, when we think about that, there has to be a understanding that you have to be humbled enough to take orders from all kinds of folks to be an ally, and not necessarily should you lead. And the way I look at that is, we have become so used to, particularly when we talk about diversity, when we talk about diversity in the Black community over things that will set the pace in the Black community. Blacks, there's a critical mass of Black folks that enjoy having leadership that is white, that is other than themselves. So these are long learned behaviors. So now, not to say that we need to abandon the entire part of that allyship, but we need to retune it. It needs to be looked at directly, that an allyship does not mean that you lead.
This is such a good question. Are there comments from say from Timberly or Jackie?
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind, and this has come up so much, especially, in the wake of George Floyd and all of that long before this, because I got so many questions about what can I do to help, or how do I help? How do I do these things? And one thing I'll say that I saw a lot, trying to put this well, is remember that when you're in allyship with someone or trying to be supportive, it's not about you, right? And so sometimes these relationships become problematic because even when you're working as an ally, I will sometimes see people where this whole experience is still all about you and what you think and how you feel and where you are. And so I think that's one place to start, is to ask, why am I coming to this and what am I hoping to do? And am I really here to be supportive? As Dr. Dixon's saying, am I willing to serve and help where I can? Or am I here to solve everybody else's problems and tell these people what to do? I think the other thing, this goes back to maybe one of my earlier comments, is that introspective piece, right? Why is it so hard to come to a person of color and figure out how to help or figure out what to say? It's not hard for everybody, right? And so some of that, I think, comes from, even with the best of intentions, still othering people like me. If you have a friend who has an issue in a certain way, you're going to go talk to them and you're going to go be a friend. You know how to be a friend. And that's in some ways what we're talking about here. And you don't have to interrogate how you be a friend to somebody who may be of your same race or orientation or whatever it might be. So I think some of being a good ally is that internal work on why the hesitancy, why you're so uncomfortable, why these conversations are hard to have, and why in some ways you even have to ask the question.
I think I just paraphrase a little bit what you're saying. I think part of this process is going to be a lot of introspection and questioning of oneself, to think about what are your motivations? How are you able to best help? How are you able to put down sort of conventional views of that you might have the answers and so on, and then really figure out what a true allyship is. I really like that kind of line of thought. So Timberly, what would you like to add?
I don't have too much. Dr. Bridgeman really, I think, took most of my talking points, but I think something I'd like to really hone in on is the self-reflection piece, not only of ideas that you hold, but the space that you take up. And I think that relates back to what Dr. Dixon has been referencing in terms of turning allyship into misplaced leadership, because I mean, there are a million sociological theories, like standpoint theory, that tells us that marginalized groups have a unique perspective on the society that they live in and solutions to it. And so there's really no way to be an ally without garnering conversations with those marginalized identities and centering those perspectives and ideas, and not necessarily in the sense of doing something like MLK Days of Dialogue and looking over this whitewashed history of this prolific civil rights leader. It's really, if you feel like you're in a place or in a space of power that you maybe don't deserve, or that someone could do better, it takes the courage to admit that, correct, and look for someone better suited. But it also takes people in maybe less specific positions, but positions of power like yourself and the Board of Trustees. You absolutely have to look for and find other perspectives in order to solve these problems that we're facing, right? And so I think the term allyship, I agree with Dr. Dixon. I think it's become overused and it's overwatered and it's been watered down. Specifically, I think it plays into the fear, right? And which is incomparable, I think, to the threat and legitimate fear of these abuses, as Dr. Bridgeman labeled them, whether it's verbal, physical, because those take mental and emotional tolls on you that the UW Counseling Center is maybe not fit to address or help mediate. And so I think to be a good ally, you have to be reflective of the space you take up, the ideas you have, and be open to criticism and not take it as an attack on your being or your allyship status, because allyship status is something that will have to constantly evolve over your lifetime as you gain more experiences and more perspectives. And so with that, you have to be open to having uncomfortable conversations, not only with these marginalized identities, but with your family at the dinner table and with the friends, down at the bar. It takes these extremely uncomfortable and difficult and sometimes alienating conversations to stand up against something and be the one person that isn't afraid of the backlash, because ultimately it's you're objectively right in sharing these thoughts and being an ally, but the fear of backlash or alienation from your friends is incomparable against legitimate racial violence.
I want to say one more thing real quick, and I know we're short on time, but I think this is an important issue, and this question's come up a few times. I think one other thing you can do is act in ways that help folks. So I've known some folks, I'm just thinking of my own experience, who did a lot to support my career that we don't think of as traditional allies, but they picked me for a job, or they recommended me for something, or supported me in certain ways, and so sometimes you can do really helpful things without being under that guise we tend to think of as an ally. And sometimes, and one of those people who helped me a lot that I'm thinking of did it in a conversation where that person said a couple really racist things, right? And then turned around and helped me. And so it doesn't have to be perfect to be effective. And sometimes I think folks get so caught up in, did I do this and how do I feel, rather than saying, when you had the choice between two people to hire, did you pick the person of color, especially if they were better qualified? That is an act of allyship. So you can engage in acts of allyship, even when you may, in some ways, be a racist person or whatever else it is. And so I think sometimes thinking about that more broadly, what kind of concrete, helpful things have you done to further an agenda or to, address an issue?
Yeah, really, really good comments all the way around. So we're actually at 8 o'clock, which is our ending time, except that I'm hearing that we still have a lot of questions. So I would, if it's all right with the panelists, I'd like to stay on for say another 15 minutes. And then we'll do another round of this because I hope that this is an indication that the campus and the community is very interested in having this conversation. So Mary, would you like to take the next one?
So let me just add to that, President Seidel. I'm going to lump, without calling out names, several comments and questions in here, and it's directed to the panel on that topic, which is they don't feel like there's enough time tonight to cover this. And are you all committed to doing this again and being available to the campus community to continue this dialogue?
I'm 100% committed to it. So I don't know when if we wait a week or I probably can do it in the next few days, but I mean, it's clearly something that's got the campus attention. And I think we really need to keep going with this. So I'm committed. I see people shaking their heads. I hope that the audience is saying the same thing. Okay,
so let me follow up on that to Dr. Dixon. Do you honestly believe that the people who need to hear this the most are joining your conversation tonight? And do you think requiring some sort of diversity training would make any difference? And should we implement that at UW?
I think I'll take them in inverted order. There is so much controversy around diversity training. And to be straightforward, the diversity training can be skewed in so many ways, from the content to the person who leads, to the person who puts the resources together to create it. So I think there is value in diversity training, but if the diversity training is crafted by and controlled by a racist, then in many ways we're looking at things that are counterintuitive. So I don't believe that alone, when we look at those kind of trainings, that they are effective without resources in a proper manner and proper follow-up. I think there's good that can come out of diversity trainings. And to add to the very first piece, did it in the inverted order, I do believe that when we talk about some of the people who are allies or some of the people who are here in positions of authority, there is a great deal of apprehension. There's a great deal of anger. There's a great deal of angst in our community now. There's also a great deal of fear of losing power. And that power in itself, when we talk about people who are losing power, then we're talking about the privileged class. I think that was quite clear when we saw what happened January 6th. So I do believe that there will be some people who will come here and say that we had a great conversation and go back to exactly the same thing they did before they came, because that was always the issue. Well, I went, there was a great conversation, but nothing changed. And until we understand as a group that giving up power is perhaps one of the most stringent and one of the most compromising things for people to do, particularly when we talk about 500 years of white superiority. This weekend, that won't go away. And I do believe that when we look at the upper brass, when we look at the composition, even when we look at some of the things that were said about a response to this event, that it all plays out in front of you. I don't think that we can take any of those responses and make them better. I think we need to deal with them straightforward. And that's the issue. There is a way, there is justifications, there are ways, there are layered nuances that people don't have to deal with these things straightforward. So coming and showing up and listening to the conversation, or even saying, let's have a part two, will that change how you'll go about creating some of these committees? Will it be the same people doing the same things, the same ways? How will things be funded? How will they be changed? How will we look at the Black Studies Center? How will we become more part of the tapestry of the University of Wyoming in a sincere way, where we're taken as seriously as any other entity on the campus? Because I really do believe that people have come out to some of these events, but have really wasted an opportunity about what Timberly talked about, critical self-reflection, and where they fall on that line about what we bring to the table. We all bring our biases to the table. Some biases carry more power. And then we go back to the power dynamic and challenging that power dynamic. So I really believe that there are some people who do want to change. I think there is people who have apprehension about changing. And I think that some people are completely stuck in their way because that privilege pays off for them daily. So when we think about what this event did, this event gave us an opportunity to do more than just have this particular conversation. This is an opportunity to rein in the idea of what an ally is and rethink it. This also allows for us to, even in a budget crunch, allocate funds to those things that are deeply devoted to diversity, equity, inclusion outside of that department. Because if we challenge that department in itself, then somewhere along the line, we can be helpful. So when I think about the majority of the people of Wyoming, I do believe that there is a critical mass of folks who are at their core racist. And I do believe that 9 times out of 10, they have positions of authority. Even if they don't have positions of authority, they're only one step away from having influence with people of authority because they think the same.
Thanks, Fred. I want to perhaps move on, and there might be other comments on diversity training. That was kind of at least one part of the question, but I think I'd like to move on to the next question just to get through the list here a little bit more. So, Mary?
So this is from Lena Blue Morris Howe, and it is also on training and development. She states that we as faculty are required to complete online diversity, equity, and inclusion training. As the educators at this institution, this is not enough. Currently, all other DEI events are optional, and you can consistently see the same choir engaging. This minimum requirement does not prepare us to meet the needs of all of our students, nor to engage in dialogue on these topics and create safe learning spaces to do so. When will the administration require professional development in diversity, equity, and inclusion so that faculty are not contributing and perpetuating systemic oppression?
Well, I'd like to have had that part of the conversation. So what, not just requiring it, as Fred was even saying, the kind of diversity training that we may be undertaking may not be effective. It may not be, it may be well-intentioned, but it's only a piece of the puzzle, and even that it has to be done carefully. So I will just say that I'm very open, looking for recommendations on what kind of training we should be doing, what would be more effective. If it's deemed ineffective, then let's talk about what we can do to grow the set of tools we have in order to address this.
So to the panel, this commenter is anonymous and the topic is a support hotline. They state, my friends at Colorado State University, yes, I know the Rams, told me about the Tell Someone number and an online referral form. UW needs support infrastructures in place. A few reasons to report include references to violence, changes in academic or work performance, behavior changes. Sometimes people just need to say something and know that there's a method for how to do so that's accessible and non-threatening. Can UW do something similar?
So I think obviously we could do it. So it's a matter of deciding to do that if that's what's needed. So I would like to look at like a set of activities that we could do, including this, and understand how we would rank them and what would be the most important thing, the most effective thing. But I mean, taken as a single item, it does sound like something we should be talking about. But I'd like to get a comprehensive view of this and then figure out where we start and what are the most important things to do first. I mean, perhaps this is one of them. I mean, perhaps you have other comments. I don't know.
No, I think that just goes to comments I made earlier, right? We don't have that support infrastructure here.
Yeah.
And I think that support infrastructure, although we haven't said it directly, is going to need several pieces. You know, a reporting piece, a place where you can talk, you know, so I think as we have that conversation and build out what that looks like, it's going to need to have a number of pieces, and they will develop over time, right? There may be some things we can do right now, some things we do later. And I think it'll be something that we need to regularly revisit and determine whether we need to make changes or add things or whatever as we move on. You know, I think one thing to think about as we're having this conversation is this work, this kind of change that we're talking about, if we're really going to do it, is a lifetime of work. And I think one of the other places where we went into trouble is you think you can just do one thing and do it for a little while and be done and it's all fixed. And one of the things I think is interesting is a lot of the things we're talking about at different points in this university's history have been in place. And they were done away with because people didn't think we needed them anymore, or people left, or whatever else it is. So I think we need to realize that this is a long-term, forever project, and it's a garden that has to be tended all the time or it wilts and dies. So I think going to it with that in mind and institutionalizing the things that are working well, so it doesn't matter who's here, these things will continue, is something to keep in mind, and that it's going to take lots of parts to make this work well.
Good. I'm just noting time, so it's we're a few minutes away from where we a few minutes ago said we would stop, but and there are many questions I'm seeing in my chat here. So perhaps a suggestion is maybe we could have some of these questions read and just to sort of as a bit of a prelude to what we might talk about next time, and maybe have some closing comments from the panelists. Would that be a good way to kind of create a bridge to the next event? So Mary, do you want to sort of try to give a representative set of questions? We'll just hear the questions as like what's out there, what are people asking about, what are they thinking about? Then we'll have some closing remarks, and then we'll organize another meeting. And this will be the second. The next one will be the second of I think of many that will come. So go ahead.
Okay, so Bill Harris asks, what does the historically racist, monolithic, and hierarchical structure of higher education have to do with atrocities like this taking place? In addition, do you think a response like yours, President Seidel, to this event is exemplary of the disconnect between administrators of higher education and Black students, staff, and faculty? Amber Hoover talks about minimization and states the faculty senate comment that tried to sweep the attack under the rug by talking about achievements with diversity shows the structural ignorance that our country suffers. White people will often say things are so much better. Their eyes are closed. The attacks and that comment show that we still have so much hard work to do and need to commit to doing. She also says as a community member, she is committed to that work. And she feels that the humanities are defunded first, but it seems that some of our biggest problems come from STEM running wild without asking fundamental questions in philosophy and in the humanities departments. Is anybody asking why we're going to Mars when we have such fundamental issues to deal with here? We cut the wrong departments. Claire Rada, who's a criminal justice student, states she's a senior this year and has taken many courses within the criminal justice department and have walked away extremely frustrated with how race is discussed. Professors seem reluctant to discuss systemic racism. Racist generalizations about crime come up often in class discussions, particularly online class discussions. It concerns me that the university is willing to instruct on topics in criminal justice without emphasizing the impact of systemic racism on that system. Can this administration commit to assessing curriculums within the criminal justice department and how those accurately present systemic racism in practice? An anonymous comment from an anonymous commenter regarding the dialogue states, I am distraught. I am forever scarred, but what I am most sad about is that how folks that I surround myself, I'm struggling with how she wrote this, that I surround myself around campus, such as Dr. Bridgeman mentions, who minimize the situation. Is there an effort or initiative to check on our Black and Brown employees that face racial fatigue on a daily basis? Will there be a directive from the provost to recognize racism on our campus? Ambrea Meadows Fernandez states that municipalities and organizations, including American Public Health Association and the American Medical Associations across the country, have acknowledged that racism is a public health issue. We know that all aspects of student health impact achievement. It impacts students and faculty's ability to thrive, feel safe, and perform in roles that contribute to the overall structure of the university. Is the university willing to publicly affirm that the impact of racism is a particular type of systemic and pervasive violence that's bigger than the name calling and general non-niceness? Regardless of state and national legislation, is the university leadership willing to collaborate with students and faculty and coordinate efforts between existing groups to explore the experience of students of color, or provide those of us who have the skill set with funding and support to do research on these experiences and officially declare racism as a health and therefore university crisis? Doing this at the university level will set the tone and allow students and faculty to speak on what they feel is missing. An anonymous comment about an ongoing conversation states, I once worked at a university that had a weekly dialogue about race group. Any student, faculty, or staff could attend. It was about people wanting to know to do better. We acknowledged none of us were subject matter experts. We talked about current events, books, podcasts, and personal experiences. Could Wyoming do something like that? It was a big university. Sometimes only 20 people would show up, but those little groups were not insignificant. Tessa De La Rosa asks President Seidel, if you would like to know the truth on the ground, why are you not present at Laramie City Council meetings? I know you're busy, but I would like to see you use your position of power to bring attention to issues of local policing and oversight. UW students are leading the way, but need educated allies. An anonymous comment says we need more listening and understanding and less feedback with comparison stories. Another anonymous comment is from a Native American graduate student who said they have taken many leadership roles across campus. I have also faced many racial injustices while I've been a student. I would like to thank Dr. Bridgeman, Dr. Dixon, and Timberly for telling the truth tonight. There have been too many times when minority student voices are disregarded as unimportant. I cannot count how many times I have attended meetings on this campus where I was told issues relating to minority students would be fixed, and look where we are today. I would like to say that just because we minority students are small in number, that does not mean that we are not human, and words don't hurt just as much as they hurt anyone else. But what I am hearing is that no matter what is done, we cannot fix implicit bias. President Seidel, please help to ensure that there will be at least one clear way for students to make reports about racial injustices that they experience as students of UW, so that they can get the resources and support they need and are not just ignored as I and so many other have been in the past. We would like to actually be heard and for there to be actions to follow. And to summarize the other group of questions, it sort of evolves around colorblindness and comments from faculty and others on campus about America being a melting pot and that they don't see color, and they are asking how do we respond to students that state this. And the last comment was one they didn't want to really be identified publicly, but I think you talked about this earlier, President Seidel, where they're asking about diversity on the Board of Trustees and what are you doing to get more diversity?
Well, that shows a deep reservoir of questions and concerns and thoughtfulness about this issue. So, or these issues, I should say, it's quite a broad set of issues. So I would like to just thank people for coming. I'd like to turn to our panelists in case you have any remarks for a minute or two, and then I'll just make a couple remarks to kind of tie it up for tonight, but noting that we'll do more to continue this dialogue and to get to many of those questions that we barely had time to even hear, but I'm in listening mode tonight, so I'm writing things down and we'll take it in. So who would like to go first?
I can go first. I don't have much to say. I think this has been a great start to a long process in not only solving these issues, but addressing ones that lie beneath the surface. And so I urge you in setting up these meetings, consider who needs to be at the table. I think this was a great panel tonight, but I think what a lot of the questions revolved around, especially in terms of the Board of Trustees, I think it's important for the people that have more power within the university. You know, you're sort of the face of a large group of people that have influence on not only your job and your role, but how virtually everything operates on campus. And so I think it's important to realize who needs to hear these things, who needs to be forced to sit through these things and hear the hard questions and present the difficult answers if necessary. And I think it's also important to value student input during these events, because they are ultimately, although we're in the same community and on the same campus, they have a much different experience and I think extremely valuable perspectives. But I think, you know, not just to President Seidel, but everyone in this Zoom, everyone that is listening and asking questions, this work takes courage. It takes being perceived as unfriendly. It takes being at risk of alienation or you know, people talking behind your back. And I think it's imperative to not only as a university, but as individuals, get your priorities straight. And so if you say that diversity, equity, and inclusion is a pillar, you have to be dedicated to ensuring that that is evident to the marginalized populations. And I think that means being able to stand up to those above you and below you that have power in the institution, and cleaning house when necessary, right? I think Dr. Bridgeman brought up a great point of, you know, there is actions that we can take in the law system, in the criminal justice system, but there are actions that you can take in a social setting and as an authority figure within campus. And so I appreciate this platform tonight. I think it's absolutely crucial to continue having these, as well as answering the questions that we received tonight and had to cut short. But with this, it's absolutely imperative to understand that all of this work will take courage, and there will be pushback, and there will be people turning their backs against you. And that's when you have to truly prove your allyship, if that's an identity you want to hold, and use your power to ensure that those people can't, you know, continue to use theirs with these toxic ideologies.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Jackie, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing I'd like to say in closing is to thank all the people who came tonight and asked all those great questions, and were willing to ask difficult questions. I think that's really important. And I do think for all our talk about the need for action, I think there is a lot of value in having an open, real conversation, right? Where you can really dig in and have this kind of dialogue. So I do hope something comes from this. I go back to, I guess, where I started. Why do we do this work? For me, as fatigued as I get, and last week was pretty fatiguing, I do it because I hope that my children and my grandchildren won't have to have these conversations when the time comes. And so as we embark on what will probably be a long journey, if we really are going to do this and do it right, I think the focus shouldn't be so much on, did we do diversity? Did we do whatever? But did we do our part in this grand scheme of things to make what we were able to influence much better than it's been before? Certainly for marginalized people, but for all of us. If we have a welcoming, supportive community at this university, that's going to be better for everybody. If we're able to attract more people who can contribute to what we're doing in meaningful ways and come here and thrive, and this be a great place for all kinds of people to be, that's going to be better for all of us. And that's going to be an institution that all of us want to be a part of. So I think if we can keep that focus in mind as we move forward and dedicate ourselves to that, there is some hope. But Dr. Dixon can tell you, I'm an eternal optimist, right? So I'm always hopeful, even when maybe I probably shouldn't be. So.
Thank you very much. And Fred, would you like to go last? Well, I'll go.
Thank you, President Seidel, for beginning this conversation. And thank you, Ms. Stafford, for, oh my God, you did a great job with handling all the questions. And I wanted to say thank you for everybody who came. And I wanted to speak as someone who looks to not quite like Dr. Jackie as this eternal optimist, but one who has hope, one who believes in humanity and the thoughts of humanity improving. And I look at this space right now and what brought us here. It was the idea of vision from Dr. Jackie and creating a Black Studies Center. And what we intend to do is democratize higher education, particularly here on this campus, which means a lot of times we'll be looked to as going too far or the bad guy. But look what came out of this. It came out of this, it was a reminder to all believers that when we talk about racism, it is in our face. When we talk about how we move forward from racism, then we haven't dealt with it directly, because before we can move forward, we need to acknowledge that it happens and then atone for it. We are well on our way to acknowledging that it happened, but I'm always thinking about how many ways can we marginalize it, even with a statement that came directly from this horrific act. To have pushback from those in the Senate shows truly the mindset of those who are setting the pace, those who are looked to for authorities. So what the Black Studies Center seeks to continue to do is challenge the mainstream narrative. Now, we're very small and in an infantile stage, but we need for President Seidel to be very straightforward about what he thinks about what the Black Studies Center is and can be, and devote resources, his time, his effort to what we want to do by democratizing education. I think in many ways, we are a gift to the University of Wyoming because we're filling gaps, and those gaps are huge. But I don't want anybody to take this with the idea of arrogance, ego, and vanity. We are here to serve, and we are dedicated. So I thank Timberly so very much for all that she does. And you will hear from her in the future, but believe that the Black Studies Center is devoted to nothing that talks about just gradualism. We understand the pace that things take to change, but we are here to make sure that that change takes place. So thank everybody for coming.
Thank you. And just a couple of comments, because I know it's running late tonight, but I want to thank you, my three incredible, articulate, inspiring panelists. I don't have enough positive words to say to you for the leadership that you're showing here. And I think you're thoughtful. You're getting at many of the issues that we need to be talking about. So I want to thank you. I want to thank more than 150 people who've apparently stayed with us for 2.5 hours on a Wednesday evening. And that shows that there's a lot of interest in this topic. And I think that goes way beyond the communities that are the diverse communities, but it includes the mainstream white communities as well. So I just want to say that I think there's a lot of interest in becoming in allyship and in figuring out what we can do together as a community to address some of these problems. So I'm committed to continuing this dialogue. I also know that the questions, I'm told by Mary that she's sort of consolidated some of them and couldn't get to all of them, but just because of time. So there is so much pent up demand for this conversation. It won't just be a conversation though. We will be then figuring out what kinds of actions we can take. And it's not just about either gradualism or short-term things we can do or to feel good. It's about really trying to address these issues. And I think it's what we need to do to be a better university. And it fits perfectly in all the things I think about. Inclusion and diversity help make us a better university when it comes to everything else we do, from scholarship to just a sense of community. It's very, very important. I mean, to me and to all of us. So anyway, I'm going on too long. I'll just say thanks to everybody. We'll be back and we'll figure out some next steps. And I just look forward to the next time we get together, which will be soon. Thank you.